Shophetim chapter 20. And all the children of Israel came out from Dan to Beersheba, and from the land of Gilead, and the congregation assembled as one man before Yahweh at Mizpah. And the leaders of all the people, all the tribes of Israel, presented themselves in the assembly of the people of Elohim, 400,000 foot soldiers who drew the sword. And the children of Benjamin heard that the children of Israel had gone up to Mizpah. And the children of Israel said, Speak up, how did this evil come about? And the man, the Levite, husband of the woman who was murdered, answered and said, My concubine and I went into Gibeah, which belongs to Benjamin, to spend the night. And the masters of Gibeah rose up against me, and surrounded the house at night because of me. They thought to kill me, but instead they humbled my concubine, and she died. Then I took my concubine and cut her in pieces, and sent her throughout all the land of the inheritance of Israel, because they committed wickedness and folly in Israel. Look, you are all children of Israel. Speak, and give your counsel here. And all the people rose as one man, saying, Let not one of us go to his tent, nor any of us turn back to his house. And now this is what we do to Gibeah. Go against it by lot. And we shall take 10 men out of every 100 throughout all the tribes of Israel, and 100 out of every 1,000, and 1,000 out of every 10,000, to make food for the people, to prepare for their going to Gibeah in Benjamin, for all the folly they did in Israel. And all the men of Israel were gathered against the city, knit together as one man. And the tribes of Israel sent men through all the tribe of Benjamin, saying, What is this evil that has come about among you? And now give us the men, the sons of Belial, who are in Gibeah, so that we put them to death, and put away evil from Israel. But the children of Benjamin would not listen to the voice of their brothers, the children of Israel. So the children of Benjamin gathered together from their cities to Gibeah, to go to battle against the children of Israel. And from their cities at that time the children of Benjamin registered 26,000 men, who drew the sword, besides the inhabitants of Gibeah, who registered 700 chosen men. Among all this people there were 700 chosen men who were left-handed. Each one could sling a stone at a hair's breadth, and not miss. And besides Benjamin, the men of Israel registered 400,000 men, who drew the sword. All of these were men of battle. And the children of Israel rose and went up to Beit El to ask of Elohim. And they said, Who of us go up first to battle against the children of Benjamin? And Yahweh said, Yehudah first. And the children of Israel rose in the morning and encamped against Gibeah. And the men of Israel went out to battle against Benjamin. And the men of Israel put themselves in battle array to fight against them at Gibeah. And the children of Benjamin came out of Gibeah, and on that day cut down to the ground 22,000 men of Israel. But the people, the men of Israel, strengthened themselves, and again formed the battle line at the place where they had put themselves in array on the first day. And the children of Israel went up and wept before Yahweh until evening, and asked of Yahweh, saying, Should I again draw near for battle against the children of my brother Benjamin? And Yahweh said, Go up against him. And the children of Israel drew near to the children of Benjamin on the second day. And Benjamin went out against them from Gibeah on the second day, and cut down to the ground 18,000 more of the children of Israel. All these drew the sword. And all the children of Israel, even all the people, went up and came to Beit El and wept, and sat there before Yahweh, and fasted that day until evening. And they offered ascending offerings and peace offerings before Yahweh. And the children of Israel asked of Yahweh. The ark of the covenant of Elohim was there in those days. And Pinchas, son of Eleazar, son of Aharon, stood before it in those days, saying, Should I yet again go out to battle against the children of my brother Benjamin, or should I cease? And Yahweh said, Go up, for tomorrow I give them into your hand. And Israel set ambushes all around Gibeah. And the children of Israel went up against the children of Benjamin on the third day, and put themselves in battle array against Gibeah, as at the other times. And the children of Benjamin came out to meet the people, drawn away from the city. And they began to strike some of the people, slaying, as at the other times, in the highways, of which one went up to Beit El, and the other to Gibeah in the field, about 30 men of Israel. And the children of Benjamin said, They are going to be smitten before us, as previously. But the children of Israel said, Let us flee, and draw them away from the city to the highways. And all the men of Israel rose from their place, and put themselves in battle array at Baal Tamar. And the ambush of Israel broke forth from their position at Ma'areh Gevah. And 10,000 chosen men from all Israel came against Gibeah, and the battle was fierce. But they did not know that calamity was close to them. And Yahweh smote Binyamin before Israel, and the children of Israel destroyed 25,100 men on that day in Binyamin. All these drew the sword, and the children of Binyamin saw that they were smitten. And the men of Israel had given ground to the Binyamites, because they trusted in the ambush that they had set against Gibeah. And the ambush hurried and came against Gibeah, and the ambush spread out and struck the entire city with the edge of the sword. And the appointed signal between the men of Israel and the ambush was that they would make a great cloud of smoke rise up from the city. Then the men of Israel would turn in battle, and Binyamin began to strike dead about 30 of the men of Israel, for they said, They are indeed smitten before us, as at the first battle. Then the cloud began to rise from the city in a column of smoke, and the Binyamites looked behind them and saw the entire city going up in smoke to the heavens. And when the men of Israel turned back, the men of Binyamin were troubled, for they saw that calamity was close to them. And they turned their backs before the men of Israel toward the way of the wilderness, but the battle overtook them, while those who had come out of the cities were destroying them in their midst. They surrounded the Binyamites, and pursued them, and with ease trampled them down as far as the front of Gibeah toward the east. And there fell of Binyamin 18,000 men, all of these were mighty men. And they turned and fled toward the wilderness to the rock of Rimmon, and they cut down 5,000 of them on the highways, and followed after them up to Gidom, and struck 2,000 of them. And all who fell of Binyamin that day were 25,000 men who drew the sword, all of these were mighty men. But 600 men turned and fled toward the wilderness to the rock of Rimmon, and they dwelt at the rock of Rimmon for 4 new moons. And the men of Israel turned back against the children of Binyamin, and struck them with the edge of the sword from every city, men and beasts, all who were found, and they set fire to all the cities they came to.